I'm here on behalf of other species. Back when I was in my 20s, this was in the 1980s, I considered myself a very strong environmentalist. I thought about it a lot. I spent a lot of time feeling very guilty about what I was doing to the planet. I spent a lot of time feeling very angry at what other people were doing to the planet. I would have internal debates on whether it was better to throw away a peanut butter jar or to use energy and water to wash it and recycle it. Like actually trying to do the math on that. I'd take a hike in a national forest, and it was just an exercise in rage because I was looking at the logging and the grazing that the Forest Service was letting happen there. Everywhere I went, I was pissed off. And at a certain point, I said, if this is what it is to be an environmentalist, I'm done with it. This is right around the time Bill Clinton was elected. And for 8 years, 2 terms of Bill Clinton, I just didn't think about it. Around then, I came to Santa Cruz for the first time, and I immediately was struck by the birds here. Next thing I knew, I was completely in love with birds, which I'd never paid any attention to. I became a bird watcher, and then a birder, and then a hardcore birder, and then an obsessive hardcore birder. And in the course of going around this country and other countries to look at birds, I became immediately aware that they needed our help, that the places they depended on were in trouble, many of them. Many species were in trouble. So I got involved in conservation. I started in bird conservation with the American Bird Conservancy, but the deeper I got into it, the more need I saw. So I started getting involved in other organizations throughout the Western Hemisphere and Europe as well, doing advocacy journalism about conservation and meeting a lot of conservationists. And one of the themes that emerged, talking to those conservationists in the field, was their frustration that the world had kind of given up on what they were doing. The mainstream environmental movement had more or less given up on what they were doing because everything, all the time, all the resources, all the attention was going to one issue: climate. The argument for that was, well, if we don't fix climate change, none of what you conservationists are doing is going to matter. Well, even at the time, more than a decade ago, I had a problem with that argument because it seemed to me equally true that if we don't save what's left of the natural world, it doesn't matter what happens to the temperature because there's not going to be any planet left to save. I was also disturbed. We are in the context of this session is binary thinking, and I was disturbed by this kind of monolithic, single-issue focus that the only way to be green was to fight climate change. I also didn't like that the motivators for that fight were precisely the ones that I'd gotten turned off on in the 80s. You got guilt, you got fear, you got anger, you've got sort of self-righteous anger. Those are not the most pleasant, and I would say successful motivators available, because once upon a time, to be green, to care about the natural world meant loving nature, loving its beauty, being moved to do something about it because you love the thing, not because you have self-interested fear or because you're angry at somebody else, but because you actually love this thing. And it seemed to me we'd lost sight of that. Flash forward a decade, now here we are, and now there may be here people who disagree with me, but I think it's becoming clear we lost the fight. Again, we set a record in 2019 for global carbon emissions. We probably will again next year too. And of course, we keep hitting new temperature records. And if you think we haven't lost, just look at the numbers, look at what the IPCC tells us we have to do to meet these targets in terms of emissions to prevent global temperatures from completely spinning out of control in a feedback loop if we get beyond another 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then look at the political situation here. and look at the political situation in China with its coal plants, look at the political situation in India and Brazil and in Europe, and ask yourself, realistically, knowing what you know about human nature, are we going to completely dismantle the entire infrastructure of the world in the next 5 years and switch over to something else? Not likely. So now what happens to the argument, well, if we don't fix this, nothing else is going to matter? Well, you could say apparently then nothing else matters. I would argue that now we're finally free of that monolithic obsession with one issue. Our eyes can open and we can see now a whole bunch of things matter. Maybe we don't want to put all our resources into this obsessive focus on emissions. Maybe we want to be diverting many, if not most, of our resources to the problems of adaptation and the problems of resilience. And resilience is very broadly conceived. It can be resilience in the face of fire, it can be resilience in the face of flooding, but also we need resilient communities. We need resilient populaces. We need resilient nations that can handle the shocks that the very much upon us climate catastrophes are going to bring. We need to strengthen all of the things that make us a society. We need to be kinder to each other because there's going to be a whole lot of stress on all of that. Is one half. The other half is nature still needs our help. The sixth extinction is upon us, and to have any hope of preserving significant biodiversity going forward in these very dark years that are coming, we need to strengthen the ecosystems we still have. We need to stop destroying them. And the thing about that is that almost all of the loss of biodiversity in my lifetime has had little, if anything, to do with climate. It's driven by other factors, other threats, overfishing, deforestation, destruction of wetlands, plastic pollution, long list of things. The thing about each of those threats is you can do something about every one of them. Unlike the problem of avoiding that 1.5 degree target of the IPCCs, you can actually do something. You can do something in your backyard. You can plant native plants. You can keep your cats indoors. The little animals and the birds will notice. You will actually make the world a better place concretely, and you can see it with your own eyes, and you can do it in a larger way too. The problem of the ocean's fisheries, serious problem, not impossible to solve. Cue the ocean. There it is. Okay, so this, believe it or not, is called the magenta petrel. Back in the 15 years ago, when I was getting serious about birds, I would look at my seabird guide, look at this, the illustration of this bird, and say, yeah, that gray has kind of a magenta-y cast. I can kind of see it. It's sort of there. It's sort of maybe lavender would be a better word. No, in fact, this species is named after an Italian research vessel, the Magenta, which in 1867, on an expedition, shot a petrel that was unknown to science. And it was called the magenta petrel. It was named, properly described, named. The specimen went to a museum in Turin. That was it. That was the only bird, the only individual of the magenta petrel that was seen for the next century. It was presumed extinct. It was just like weird or whatever the heck that was. It's the magenta petrel. It's in some museum in Turin. However, in the mid-60s, an ornithologist from New Zealand named David Crockett had this idea. He'd been looking at the bones of seabirds on this island called Chatham Island, 2 hours east of Auckland, New Zealand. And these bones didn't really match up with any other birds that were really known. And he compared them to the one specimen of the magenta petrel, and he thought, oh, I wonder if that's the bird. I wonder if this bird is still around. It turned out that there were reports of a bird called the tycho. About 800 years ago, Chatham Island was home to at least 10 million, maybe as many as 100 million seabirds. Along came people. The first people to come were the Moriori. they were pretty cool. They did kill a lot of seabirds and eat them. They were hungry, that's what they did, but there were a lot of seabirds. Then came the Maori. The Maori brought livestock, particularly pigs, and started clearing the land. Then came the Europeans, and they basically they wiped out the island, basically, turned it into a giant sheep and cattle farm. So that by the turn of the 20th century, so around 1900, there was only this little scrap of forest left, but Crockett had heard people talking about people's grandfathers still going in and taking tychos out of the burrows where they were with their chicks in the forest. So he says, okay, I'm going to go look in that forest. What happens is this forest is now owned by a sheep farming family named the Tuanuis, just sheep farmers. This weird guy from the mainland New Zealand shows up and says, hey, I think there's a really rare bird that might conceivably still be in your forest. And the guy, Manuel Tuanui, says, that's cool, let me help you. So he and his teenage son, Bruce, spend 4 years, not all the time, but during breeding season, looking for petrels. They're running around in the forest, but these burrows are very well concealed, you can't find them. They've got searchlights down by the shore. It takes them 4 years until one night they see 2 birds and they say, whoa, what is that? Sure looks like a tycho. 5 years after that, despite a lot of trying, the Tuanuis and the ornithologists succeed in capturing one of them, actually more than one, I think, that night. A little while later, they manage to radio track the birds to a burrow. They find 2 active burrows. This bird is still alive. It is not extinct. It is breeding in this forest. The Tuanuis, meanwhile, have they're still farming, but they've been putting more and more resources, and they say, well, my God, this is incredible. They give the forest basically to the New Zealand government. And the neighbors are all saying, what? Are you mental? Or what have you done? And they said, no, I mean, this is an incredible thing. And the whole family's into it. The daughter-in-law, who now leads the family trust, everyone got into it. It's a whole family effort. And they proceed to fence and keep out predators and eliminate predators, hunt, just all the invasive species, and the population grows. They're finding more and more tycho. And that's still going on. And in the meantime, they got ambitious because it's like, hey, we're good at this. We're just sheep farmers, but we're pretty good at this. So now they brought in 2 other rare birds that nest on nearby islands to create alternate safe breeding spaces for those birds, Chatham petrel and the Chatham albatross. And the best thing at all is that this really ecologically devastated. You think, oh, cool, an island off the coast of New Zealand, that's going to be so beautiful. You land at the airport and you say, wow, this looks like Iowa in the middle of the winter. This is not pretty, this is not nice. But more and more of the island, all over the island, the neighbors who once thought the Tuanuis were mental are starting to put up their own fences and starting to do their own predator control. Why did this happen? It's because they're sitting at their breakfast table and an old lady, this is one story, looks out the window and says, oh my God, what is that bird doing there? I haven't seen that bird since I was a girl. Not a seabird, just one of the native endemic species to the island. I haven't seen that bird since I was a girl. Turns out, well, the Tuanuis, what they're doing, protecting the forest, protecting the bush, eliminating predators, it's bringing all these species back. So you have this thing, you have Chatham Island, which kind of looks like the dystopian future we think we're facing with climate change. On the theme of regeneration, this is regeneration. It is all coming back there because of one family loving this bird. Thank you very much.